from the government. They weren't getting answers from
Urquhart, the time for debate has expired. Clerk.
Government business order of the day, resumption of debate on the second reading of the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016 and on the amendment moved by Senator Collins.
Senator Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. The crossbench senators certainly have their differences, and I would argue that even though there is only a relatively small number of us, we are a true broad church. But we do have one thing in common, one thing that justifies our existence, and that is that we are not rubber stampers. We are here because 25% of Australian voters did not want rubber stampers in the Senate, the House of Review. Therefore, we of course don't always endorse the government's legislative agenda, but we do try to get to the bottom of the issues and approve, reject or amend legislation according to our assessments. Sometimes in this very chamber, ministers would even praise the constructive approach from us. So why have they formed the Liberal National Greens Xenophon Union, the LNGXU, to wipe out the crossbench? Why, all of a sudden, has the same crossbench become the coalition's enemy? I can tell you, Mr. Acting Deputy President, that being a crossbench senator is not easy. I'm often expected to have a view on anything and everything. I'm required to have discussions with ministers and shadow ministers on subjects they have researched for years. But that's okay. They may have earned more knowledge on such subjects than me, but while I was busy living a civilian life. But I enjoy those discussions because I can pick their brains. That is why, when I came into this place, I came with a promise. All sides of politics always get a fair hearing from me. This has been the principle I operate under. I know some of the crossbench senators are fair and balanced too. However, despite all our hard work and the voting record that speaks for itself, whenever the government fails to pass a bill, we are likely the ones to blame. Ironically, the Greens have suddenly become the Liberal National Coalition's new mates. So what does this bill do? Or should the real question be, what does the LNGXU want to do through this bill? Well, there is all sorts of analysis with all sorts of predicted outcomes. One thing for sure is that there will be even fewer small party senators, representing the growing number of voters who just don't want the established party machines. But instead of working harder to win back voters' hearts, the established parties want to ignore them and just make it harder for their votes to elect a senator from a smaller party. Let me put it in the context of a footy game. The losing team, despite how badly they wish to turn the game around, should never ever be allowed to change the rules to favour them, nor, of course, should the winning team. In this place, however, the Parliament is the rule-maker, and political parties are teams. One footy team cannot be allowed to change rules, but in the Parliament right now, one very unexpected team, the LNGXU, is changing the rules. The fact that one side of the chamber endorses these changes and the other side strongly opposes them speaks volumes about how fishy these changes are. A lot has been said by many about what this bill does and how flawed it is. But, Mr. President, there are genuine and much more important issues involving electoral voting that this bill doesn't even mention. For instance, Western Australians had to vote twice in the 2013 election because almost 1,400 ballot papers disappeared during the first election. How much extra did it cost taxpayers? $20 million. Multiple votes were another big issue in the 2013 election. The AEC sent inquiry letters to over 18,000 voters who had multiple marks recorded beside their names. Of those, some 8,000 cases were referred to the AFP, compared to only 19 such cases in 2010. About 10,000 multiple votes were attributed to official error. Official error. What does it mean? Who made the errors? And most importantly, how can such errors be stopped from happening again? The lost ballot papers, the multiple votes. Look at the numbers. It is reasonable to believe that the results of a few seats could be changed. I can't even imagine how devastating it is to democracy, an electoral system that allows for these sort of errors and odd behaviour was to be exploited by evil minds. Any genuine and legitimate electoral voting reform must give these issues the utmost priority to safeguard and defend our democracy. This bill, however, is silent on this matter, silent on protecting democracy. Yes, Mr. Acting Deputy President, the crossbench is a broad church because of vast differences in our life experiences. But I say this, if the government has no clue at all on how to deal with one builder, one vet, one engineer, one blacksmith, one soldier, one sawmill worker, and one footballer, how can the government deal with everyday Australians? Maybe here's a good starting point. Focus your energy on being a good government. Make effort in proposing fair and reasonable bills. Let the Senate do its job without any further blackmailing and bullying. Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President.
Well, thank you, Senator Wong, and I'll now call Senator Wong. The other Senator Wong.
The other Senator Wong. Different character. I'm talking about the Chinese, not the
Chinese
personalities.
character.
Yes,
I
thank
get that. Well, we'll go with that.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016. Labor opposes this bill because it is wrong for Australian democracy. It is the wrong policy response to the issues raised by preference harvesting. And it is a bill that is being pursued through the wrong process. The process that we have witnessed is a gagging of debate, a sham half-day inquiry, and a process which curtails the rights of the minorities in this chamber. This bill makes changes to the voting system for this chamber in response to concerns about preference harvesting. But in doing so, it creates another problem. It disenfranchises more than 3 million voters, people who at the last election chose to vote for someone other than the major parties or the Greens. It disenfranchises them from having their votes count towards electing members of this place. We know this bill seeks to implement an unprincipled deal between the government and the Greens, and we know this unprincipled deal is being pursued out of political self-interest. Political self-interest by the Liberals so they can implement measures like $100,000 university degrees, a GP tax and cuts to age pensions and family benefits. And political self-interest by the Greens so they can eliminate their rivals on the crossbench. So they can eliminate their rivals. It is an unprincipled deal between two unprincipled leaders. A Prime Minister who has already sold out his own principles, ranging from marriage equality to climate change, in order to win the leadership of the Liberal Party. And now Mr Turnbull wants to rewrite Senate voting rules so he can go to a double dissolution to get Tony Abbott's budget through the parliament. And the Greens leader, Senator Di Natale, has already sold out his party's principles by voting to cut age pensions and to let big companies hide how much tax they pay. And now Senator Di Natale has entered a deal with the Liberals to purge the Senate of the Greens' competitors and to disenfranchise millions of voters. Labor acknowledges that the current Senate voting system can be improved. There are issues when large numbers of candidates stand for the Senate and when some seek to game the system through preference harvesting deals. But it is a fundamental principle of democracy that everybody's vote must count. Yet here we have two established political parties using their power to reduce the opportunity for independents and minor parties to win positions in the Senate. And that, Mr Acting Deputy President, that is just as much a case of gaming the system as anything anyone described as a preference harvester has done. It is a deal designed to purge this Senate of independents and minor parties for all time. As I said, at the last election, 1 in 4 voters, 3.3 million Australians, gave their first preference to Senate candidates other than the major parties or the Greens. Now, under this bill, millions of these votes will be exhausted, that is, not counted. That is not democratic. This bill will also mean more coalition senators are elected. It makes it highly likely that the coalition will win 3 of the 6 Senate positions in each state in a half-Senate election, and that puts the coalition closer to a working majority in the Senate, certainly closer than it would otherwise be but for these changes. If this system had been in place at the last election, Mr Abbott's 2014 budget would probably now be law. $100,000 degrees, Medicare co-payments, cuts to the pension, cuts to family payments, and young Australians waiting 6 months to access unemployment benefits. The Greens are so determined to purge their competitors, they are willing to risk the Senate turning into a rubber stamp for Liberal governments. What does that say about this Greens political party? They're so determined to purge their competitors, they're willing to risk this Senate becoming a rubber stamp for the coalition. That is not the action of a progressive party. I want to explain in a little more detail how the bill disenfranchises voters. The current Senate voting system is a compulsory preferential system, and that means that the vast majority of votes elect a senator or ultimately go to the 7th unsuccessful candidate in the race. The deal between the government and the Greens changes this to optional preferential voting, and under such a system, large numbers of Senate votes will be exhausted from the count once their preferences run out. At the 2013 election, over 3 million voters gave their first preference Senate vote to parties other than the coalition, the Labor or the Greens. Under an optional preferential system, the vast majority of these votes would have been exhausted, that is 3 million votes would have been exhausted. Nearly a quarter of the formal votes cast would ultimately not have counted towards the final result. And this analysis is supported by the Parliamentary Library, and I'm going to quote this passage. Australian voters have spent 30 years voting one above the line, and it seems reasonable to assume that many people will continue to do so despite the ballot paper instructions and any media campaigns. The only parties that could reasonably be expected to transfer preferences at sufficient numbers to elect another candidate are the larger parties, the ALP, the coalition parties and the Greens. Directing preferences consistently under the new system is only possible through the how to vote cards, and only the larger parties have the infrastructure to distribute these to their supporters across the state. So the Parliamentary Library analysis is making clear that the only parties who are going to be able to transfer preferences such that they matter are the coalition parties and the Greens and the Labor Party. This is designed. Senator Rhiannon is talking about. This is designed. You've designed this system to purge this Senate of your competitors, and you should be honest enough to stand up and say it. This analysis is also supported by academic experts. Emeritus Professor John Warhurst from the ANU has said the changes will replace the problem of preference harvesting with a new problem of exhausted votes. He said all the focus has been on getting the micro-parties, and that it has almost become a justification for the reforms. Once you move to optional preferential, there is the exhausted vote syndrome. It is a problem. It's almost the alternative problem. Dr Nick Economou from Monash University has warned that the new rules will significantly increase the number of exhausted votes. He says, if we looked at the results of the last election and we applied the new rules, you would be looking at exhausted votes in each state of anywhere between 14 and 20%. 14 and 20%. Now, normally exhausted votes are only a handful, so the exhaustion process, I think, is going to be the new disenfranchising of voters. The new disenfranchising of voters. Under the current system, all votes are in play until the final seat is filled in each state. Under the proposed new system, votes for independents and minor parties will be exhausted unless the voter preferences the coalition Greens or Labor. Exhausted votes won't count towards electing a senator. Those voters will be disenfranchised. And, Mr Acting Deputy President, this is not an accident. This outcome is not an accident. It's the whole point of this deal. It's the whole point of this deal. This bill is designed to exhaust the 3 million strong minor and independent party vote, or to corral it to the major parties or the Greens. That's the whole purpose of this legislation. It is an utterly cynical approach by the Greens, who now criticise preferential voting and group voting tickets. And I'll take Senator Rhiannon is interjecting again, so let's talk about her. Let's talk about her, because her party and her personally, she personally in the past, have benefited from these arrangements. When the Greens were first emerging as a new political force, several of their candidates were elected to the Senate with low primary votes. Former Green senators Valentine and Margetts from Western Australia were elected with primary votes of less than half a quota, elected on preference flows. Former Green Senator Kerry Nettle from New South Wales was elected with a primary vote of just 4%, and she was elected on preference flows from One Nation. And the architect of this deal, who is here interjecting in the chamber, Senator Lee Rhiannon, began her parliamentary career by being elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council with 2.9% of the primary vote. 2.9%. And now she wants to purge this Senate of anybody who is elected from primary votes of 9, 10 and 12%. So she gets elected on 2.9%, but she says Senator Lionhelm, Senator Lazarus and Senator Wang, who were elected with more than 9%, they should be gone. They should be gone. Yet she was first elected with 2.9% back in 1999. What hypocrisy! What hypocrisy! And she comes in here behind her leader, an unprincipled leader, telling us this is all about principle. It's all about electoral advantage, and you should be upfront about that. And I recall also, Senator Rhiannon, back in 1999, you also advocated term limits for Green parliamentarians. Well, anyway, enough said on that. Back when the Greens were just getting started as a micro-party, it's not to the Greens' credit, Mr Deputy President, that having used preferential voting to build up their position, they now seek to pull up the drawbridge behind them. And if this system that they are now supporting had been in place 20 years ago, the Greens would have been a passing phase and they would have been shut out of this Senate. Now they have done a deal with the Liberals to impose barriers to entry to this place for independents and emerging parties. It's not only cynical, it is fundamentally anti-democratic. Now, Labor is actually the only major party in this place which is advocating for the national interest rather than our self-interest, because the changes made by this bill will probably advantage us. We will probably get more Labor senators under this bill. I've said that publicly. We would probably have more Labor senators under this bill. But despite this, we are taking a stand because we do not believe this is the right reform, right change for the country. We think this is an unprincipled deal done by unprincipled leaders who are seeking electoral advantage. We are opposing this bill because it will purge the Senate of small parties and independents. It will prevent new parties from securing election to the Senate. It will exhaust up to 3 million votes. It will disenfranchise the 1 in 4 Australians who don't vote for the major parties or the Greens, and it risks turning the Senate into the rubber stamp for the coalition governments. And of course, in the current context, it is also the Greens, with this deal, are handing Mr Turnbull the keys to a double dissolution election. The keys to the double dissolution election. And they know that, and they made a mistake, and their supporter base knows that. I want to talk briefly about process, because these are the largest changes in 30 years on how Australians elect people to the Senate. Laws that determine how our representatives are elected to Parliament shouldn't be cooked up behind closed doors and rammed through. The policy response here is wrong and the process is wrong. And the dangers of ramming this legislation through have also already been exposed. The day after introducing the bill to the House, the government was forced to rewrite the bill to fix a serious mistake. The bill would have prevented assistant returning officers from counting Senate first preferences on election night. They forgot to make sure they counted. It took the ABC's Anthony Green to point out this blunder. So the government had to rush in 6 amendments to the House of Representatives to fix this mistake. And now there are further amendments which have been circulated by the government and the Greens in this place. I mean, how many more mistakes are there in this bill? So I invite anybody listening to think about what we have witnessed in the Senate this week. We've seen the coalition of the Greens in lockstep, voting to shut up the people they don't like, voting to shut down the arguments they don't like, voting to deny senators the opportunity to vote and to speak. It's an early insight, Mr Deputy President, into their vision for the future of this Senate: less diversity and fewer voices. And it is a bill which is the latest in a series of bills that Senator Di Natale has done with the Liberal Party since he took over as Greens leader. He's complained about us holding him to account for his deals, but he seems to have developed a case of amnesia about his own actions. So let's remind the Green supporters about Senator Di Natale's deals with Mr Abbott and Mr Turnbull. 6 weeks after he took over as leader, the Greens voted with the government to pass Tony Abbott's budget measure cutting age pensions by $2.4 billion. In August last year, the Greens voted to allow the Health Minister to ignore expert advice on medical research funding. They voted with the Coalition to defeat Labor amendments requiring the Minister to follow recommendations from an independent advisory body when making multi-million-dollar medical research funding decisions. They voted with the Coalition to defeat a motion calling on the government to honour its promise to procure 12 submarines for the Navy through a local build. They voted with the Liberals and the Nationals to erect new barriers against investment. And in December, Senator Di Natale did a deal with the Liberals to let big companies keep how much tax they pay a secret from the public by voting with the Coalition to defeat Labor amendments requiring large private companies making more than $100 million in profits to disclose how much tax they pay. And I'm not surprised they're yelling at me because they don't like to be reminded of this. Now, while I'm here, I now wish to turn to amendments. Can I foreshadow a second reading amendment circulated on sheet 7881 pursuant to Standing Order 1142 to omit now from the question that this bill be now read a second time and substitute instead this day 6 months. It makes clear the opposition's view that this legislation should not proceed. And if the Greens really don't want to hand Mr Turnbull the keys to a double dissolution election, they should consider this amendment. But they won't. They won't. They wouldn't. They won't. They won't consider it. Mr Deputy President, Labor opposes this latest Greens-Liberal deal. And given that the deal has been done and the Greens are taking their marching orders from the Liberals, Labor will move amendments to the bill to improve transparency around political donations in our system. So Labor will move to reduce the donations disclosure threshold from 13,000 to 1,000 and remove CPI indexation. Labor will move to ban foreign political donations. Labor will move to ban anonymous donations above $50 to registered political parties. And Labor will move to limit donation splitting that evades disclosure requirements. These amendments implement long-standing Labor policy, and they are about transparency in our democracy and in our electoral donation laws. And I say to the Greens, here is a test for you. Will you support these reforms to the electoral laws dealing with political donations? Because these amendments reflect your policies. Your policies. And you have an opportunity, because you have the numbers with the government, to insist on these amendments passing. So you should be saying to Senator Cormann, yes, we've got a deal, but we want, as part of it, the reforms that Senator Milne and Senator Brown and your party has been arguing for years. And if you don't, everyone will see the extent of the unprincipled nature of the secret deal that you, Senator Rhiannon and Senator Di Natale, have engaged in. You've done a deal and you haven't even been prepared to say to them, we will be insisting, if you're going to change our electoral laws, if we're going to cut a dirty deal behind closed doors, we are going to want reforms to our electoral donation system. You didn't bother with that. You didn't bother with that because you were so fixated on the electoral advantage that this system will bring to you. If the Greens are serious about their policies and their rhetoric on political donations, they will support these amendments. This is a test for them. Will the Greens vote for their own policies? Will they vote for transparency around donations? Or will they take their voting orders from the Liberal Party? Will they take their voting orders on electoral donation reform from the Liberal Party? Or will they do what they did on marriage equality this morning and sell out their own principles in pursuit of a grubby voting deal? again. Mr Deputy President, we should consider ways of removing incentives for gaming the Senate voting system. But you don't do that by purging new parties and independents from this parliament. This is what the Liberal-Greens deal would do. This is what the legislation, the bill before the Senate would do. The Liberal-Greens deal disenfranchises Australians who vote for small parties and independents, discourages people from standing for the Senate or from organising new parties, reduces participation in our political system, risks a working majority for the coalition in the future, and, important at this point in time, hands Malcolm Turnbull the keys for a double dissolution election. You'd have to wonder why the Greens would do such a deal. None of these things is good for democracy in Australia. The disenfranchising of people who vote for small parties, the discouragement of people standing for the Senate, the reduction of participation in our political system, none of this is good for democracy in Australia. We need to get the balance right on Senate voting reform, and it will not happen by ramming this grubby, self-interested backroom deal through the parliament. So I say to the Australian Greens, this is a dirty deal done in secret. You are a party that has lectured this chamber for years about transparency. You are ramming this bill through after a half-day hearing where the report on the proposed bill had already been written before the hearing in order to enable debate to start the next day. This is not the way to do Senate reform.
Sorry to say, Senator Wong, but your time has expired. Senator Cormann.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I thank all those many senators who have contributed to this debate, which I believe is taken close to 20 hours now since we first received the message from the House of Representatives. Now, the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016 will ensure that future Senate election results truly reflect the will of the Australian people. The measures in this bill will empower voters to direct their preferences according to their wishes instead of having them traded and directed by backroom operators in political parties through insufficiently transparent group voting ticket arrangements. Some speakers in this debate have asserted that these reforms will advantage one political party or another. That is not correct. The only people who get advantaged by this reform are voters. Voters who will now be able to direct where their preferences go. Don't take my word for it. Let me quote to you the comments of a Labor shadow cabinet minister, a senior Labor shadow cabinet minister, a long-serving Special Minister of State and until recently the shadow Special Minister of State representing the Labor Party. This is what he said on this point in the Federation Chamber this morning. And I'm quoting him. Now, over the course of the last few weeks, there have been many pieces of misinformation spread about the bill that is currently being debated. Some have said that the bill will deliver the coalition 38 or 39 members, a controlling majority in the Senate. That is not true. This is Mr Gray in the House of Representatives this morning, and I'm continuing to quote. That is not true unless people vote for it. And if people vote for it, that is how the ballot falls. And I'm quoting him still. None of us can predict the outcome of future elections, but all of us should be concerned about future elections being manipulated by pop-up parties being created and by outcomes being confected by those whose interests are not in the national interest, are not in the interests of the people and are not in the interests of our community. I could not have put it better myself. Candidates putting their hand up for election to the Senate will do well or not so well, depending on how well they do in persuading people across Australia to support them at the next election, or indeed at any subsequent election. And that is the way it should be. That is precisely the way it should be. The result of the next election is, of course, entirely and appropriately a matter for the Australian people. The bill responds to key elements of the interim and final reports of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters inquiry into the 2013 federal election, which were tabled on 9 May 2014 and 15 April 2015, respectively. And again, some speakers on the Labor side have argued that our reforms bore no resemblance to the recommendations, the unanimous recommendations made by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. Well, let me answer that question again, or that criticism that has been raised again in the words of the long-serving Special Minister and Shadow Special Minister of State representing the Labor Party, continuing Senior Labor Shadow Cabinet Minister Gary Gray. This is what he said in the Federation Chamber as recent as this morning. They, that is these reforms, are 95% of the reforms that were recommended by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. So don't take my word for it. This is what a senior Labor Shadow Cabinet Minister has said as late as this morning. Now, the Labor Party is deeply divided on this. The truth of the matter is that when this issue was comprehensively considered by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, it was Labor members on that committee that most strongly advocated for the reforms that the government has put forward here to improve Senate voting arrangements. It was Labor members on that committee that were among the strongest advocates. It was the Labor Deputy Chair of that committee, Alan Griffin, who 12 months ago was urging the government on to get on with it. It was Mr Gray, a senior Shadow Cabinet Minister, who went on national television, who went to the West Australian, in my home state of Western Australia, who went anywhere and everywhere to urge the government to get on with it and implement these reforms. And of course, as recent as this morning, he has said that the reforms in front of the Senate actually implement 95% of what the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters unanimously recommended should be done to improve our Senate voting arrangements. The bill proposes to introduce optional preferential voting above the line, with voters to number at least 6 squares in the order of their preference, except where there are fewer than 6 squares above the line. It also abolishes individual and group voting tickets to return the control of preferences to voters, precisely what was recommended by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. It removes the capacity for an individual to be the registered officer or deputy registered officer of multiple political parties, again entirely consistent with the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, and it allows political party logos to appear on ballot papers for both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The government has considered the issues raised and the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters in its most recent report inquiring into this bill to introduce a form of optional preferential voting below the line as well as above the line, and we have decided to adopt that recommendation. So when Senator Wong talks about mistakes, no, there weren't mistakes. But what we have done is we have gone through the proper parliamentary process. We have put our bill to the scrutiny of a parliamentary committee which has got the job and the expertise to scrutinise that bill. And of course that committee made some recommendations which we have supported, and they are reflected in our amendments.
Order. Senator Cormann. Senator Wong.
It's misrepresenting what I said. The reference I made was to your mistake in forgetting to ensure the votes would be counted.
There is no point of order. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr President. Hansard will show that Senator Wong asserted that the fact that we are proposing to amend this bill in the Senate now is somehow a mistake. It's not a mistake. It's just that we have taken on board the considered recommendations on how our very good bill could be further improved that were made in the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. The government, as I've already indicated, will move amendments to that effect during the committee stages of the debate on the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016. Those amendments will provide for instructions to voters to number at least 12 boxes from 1 to 12 in order of their preference when voting below the line, together with a related savings provision that any vote with at least 6 boxes numbered from 1 to 6 below the line would still be considered formal. Taken together, the measures in this bill will give voters greater control over their vote, increase transparency and simplify the Senate voting system. As I've said right at the outset, these reforms are important reforms. They are reforms which will ensure that future Senate election results truly reflect the will of the Australian people. The measures in this bill will empower voters to direct their preferences according to their wishes, instead of having them traded and directed by backroom operators in political parties through insufficiently transparent group voting ticket arrangements. I commend this bill to the Senate.
The question is the amendment moved by Senator Collins be agreed to. Those in favour say aye. Those against, no. I think the noes have it. The ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
Lock the doors. The question is that the second reading amendment moved by Senator Collins be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart teller for the ayes, Senator McKenzie teller for the noes. Order. There being 36 ayes and 26 noes, the matter is resolved in the affirmative. Senators, there may be some further divisions relating to other second reading amendments. Senator Wong, did you wish to move your second reading amendment or not? So it hasn't been moved yet. Senator Wong.
I did want to ask Mr Deputy President, which order, because senators may not be aware, thank you, there are 3 others or 2 others.
My understanding, Senator Wong, is there is one from you and one from Senator Moore and one from Senator McAllister that is not going to be called upon, not proceeding with. So, out of courtesy to you being leader of the opposition, I've gone to yours first.
Thank you.
So, Senator Wong, do you wish to?
I move the second reading amendment as circulated in the sheets in the chamber on sheet number 7881, standing in my name.
The question is that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. The question is that the second reading amendment moved by Senator Wong be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart teller for the ayes, Senator Fawcett teller for the noes. Order. There being 25 ayes and 35 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative. Senator Moore, do you wish to move your second reading amendment? Senator Moore.
Thank you, Mr President. I wish to move the amendment that I foreshadowed in my earlier speech, which is on sheet 7892, and it refers to a statement by the Minister for Finance, the Special Minister of State, specifying the harm to the commercial interests of the Commonwealth that could result from the disclosure of information in the documents recording communications between the Australian Electoral Commission and either the Department of Finance or ministers in the finance portfolio relating to proposed electoral reform in the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016.
The question is that second reading amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. No. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. The question is that the second reading amendment be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart teller for the ayes and Senator Fawcett teller for the noes. Order. There being 25 ayes and 34 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative. The question now is that the bill be read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. No. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. The question is the bill be now read a second time. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Fawcett Teller for the ayes and Senator Urquhart Teller for the noes. Order there being 34 ayes and 23 noes, the matter is resolved in the affirmative. I call the clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918 and for related purposes.
Senator McAllister.
Mr President, pursuant to Standing Order 1152A, I move that the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016 be referred to the Finance and Public Administration Legislation Committee for inquiry and report by the 12th of May 2016. I understand I have 5 minutes to address this question. Is that
You do,
that's
Senator
correct?
McAllister.
20 minutes, you think? Mr President, it's no secret that those of us on this side of the chamber have been frustrated and disappointed by the timeframe in which this bill has been sought to be dealt with in this chamber. People here understand that these are significant changes to our electoral laws that speak to the character of this chamber and the character more broadly of our democracy. And it is true that it's generated an interesting public debate already about the nature of representation in a chamber such as this, which is characterised by proportional representation. I was only today asked by a member of the public, can you explain to me what are the issues at stake in this debate around electoral reform that is being dealt with in the Senate? And I, of course, gave my perspective on the issues at stake to the person who was making the inquiry, but it drew home to me the challenge that we face, which is that the community has not had time to engage with these significant changes. Now, I know that those opposite and those in favour of moving this bill through this place quickly have argued repeatedly that this was all dealt with in JSCM. Well, people in this chamber don't accept that. Many people in the opposition senators feel that the bill differs substantially from the issues which were canvassed in JSCM. But more significantly, everybody here understands that when a Senate committee starts investigating an idea in the abstract, there is a certain level of interest from a particular group in the community that always takes an interest in those policy issues. It is, however, at the point of legislation that community interest is truly piqued. It is when the parliament decides that it is actually going to take a step towards implementing recommendations of a committee that the community starts to understand that this is something that might impact them. And I would say to senators here that that is the point that has now been reached amongst ordinary people in the Australian community. And it's for that reason that I consider this bill does need to be referred for a proper legislative inquiry. Now, it may be that people want to make the argument in response to this amendment that the more recent JSCM hearing was adequate, but I just want to remind senators of the facts surrounding that process. There was a very limited time made available for individual citizens to provide submissions to that committee. I don't believe we can have any confidence at all that the full range of citizens who may have wished to contribute to this debate were able to do so in the time allowed for the preparation of submissions to the JSCM. I would also make, I think, the very obvious point that 4 hours is a plainly insufficient period of time in which to conduct a hearing. It is hard to think of another piece of legislation that we just whipped through in 4 hours. We're about to date deal soon, I understand, with Senator Fifield's media reform bill, and that bill that's going to have 2 days worth of hearings to look at that piece of legislation. But when it comes to the most significant electoral reforms in 30 years, the time allocated is just 4 hours. And I don't think you have to be a partisan participant in this debate to recognise that that is a simply unacceptable arrangement. One consequence of that is that there was an inadequate representation of the variety of views on this bill at that hearing. Inevitably, a 4-hour hearing allows for a very limited number of witnesses. It allows for an even more limited number of questions to be asked of those witnesses, particularly for a bill which is of such great interest to such a broad range of senators. And again, I would say to people in the chamber that you do not have to be particularly partisan to accept the argument that the procedures and scrutiny of this bill that has only just come before this chamber has been completely inadequate. I'd conclude by just drawing people's attention to the ludicrous reporting timeframe. The hearing finished at 5. Committee Secretariat went away to write up the findings of the committee. Labor senators had between 10 o'clock at night and 8 o'clock the next morning to review the findings of the committee. It's simply unacceptable, and I urge senators to accept the amendment.
Thank you, Senator McAllister. Senator McDonald.
Mr President, I'm sorry to interrupt the proceedings. I just raise a point of order with you. I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are some senators in this place who are improperly attired. One of them a minister, no less. Not only do they have very loud socks on, but they have different socks on each feet. Now, I've approached them myself. Mr President. They tell me it's some excuse about Down Syndrome Day,
Senator
but I draw
there
it
is
to
no
your
point
attention.
of order. Despite how good the cause is, there's no point of order. Senator Cormann.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Listening to that contribution just now and noting that the Labor Party is yet again trying to defer consideration by the Senate of this very important reform, which has been considered in the Senate by more than 20 hours now, for more than 20 hours now, which has been inquired into by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters for more than 2 years. No wonder that Labor's senior shadow cabinet minister Gary Gray said in the Federation Chamber today, and I'm quoting him, "I must say, the position taken by my party continues to simply make me sad." That's what Mr. Gray said this morning. And we, of course, all know on this side of the chamber that Mr. Gray is a highly regarded, highly respected senior Labor Member of Parliament who was a long-serving Special Minister of State, a long-serving Shadow Special Minister of State. He's regarded highly on both sides of politics, and today the Labor Party just makes him sad. And today, Senator McAllister, you didn't have to accept this job that was handed to you by the Tactics Committee of the Labor Party, because the Senate has already voted on several occasions on this exact point. And the person that you replace in this chamber, the very highly regarded former Senator John Faulkner, was part of the committee which nearly 2 years ago recommended the improvements to Senate voting arrangements that are here in the Senate before us today. The Labor Deputy Chair of that committee, Mr. Griffin, the member for Bruce, urged the government 12 months ago to get on with it. Mr. Gray, the Shadow Special Minister of State at the time, went on national television urging the government to get on with it. And of course today, Mr. Gray told the House of Representatives that our reforms achieve, and I'm quoting him here, 95% of the reforms that were recommended by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. 95%. Now, the 5% that we're not doing wasn't actually a good idea. That's why we discarded it. Now, Mr. President, the Labor Party today is sadly very juvenile. What we are putting before the Senate today for consideration, what the Greens have indicated they are prepared to support, what Senator Xenophon has indicated he is prepared to support, is actually doing the right thing. It is doing the right thing in the public interest. What we are doing is to ensure that future Senate election results truly reflect the will of the Australian people. That is what we're doing. And by passing these reforms, the Senate will ensure that voters are empowered to direct their preferences according to their wishes, instead of having them traded and directed by backroom operators in political parties through insufficiently transparent group voting ticket arrangements. Now, I understand why people like Senator Carr and Senator Conroy don't like that, because they've made a career out of being backroom operators. I know that Senator Carr and Senator Conroy are the chief national secretary of the backroom operators union. We know that Senator Carr is the chief operating officer of the backroom operators union. So we understand why Senator Carr comes in here to stand up for the backroom operators of Australia, for the union heavies of Australia. But Senator McAllister, you are better than that. You represent in this chamber, you come into this chamber after the august, highly regarded former Senator John Faulkner, who actually has his fingerprints all over these recommendations, who was behind these recommendations, who was a strong advocate for what is in front of us here, who was part of the committee that unanimously recommended that we do what is here in front of the Senate today. So instead of playing games as if you're still in student politics, you should actually get involved in the substance of the debate. You say you want to have a debate, let's have the debate. Let's get into the committee stages of the debate. Let's get into the substance of it, instead of running all these procedural little games. Now, if you still want to be here on Easter Friday, on Good Friday, that's fine. Let's be here on Easter Friday. We will be here until this legislation is dealt with. We will be here until this legislation has been dealt with by the Senate, because this is something that is very much in the national interest. This is very much in the interest of the people of Australia, because we on this side are absolutely committed to ensuring that future Senate election results truly reflect the will of the Australian people.
Thank you, Senator Cormann. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. President. Listening to Senator Cormann here now, we hear just repeated versions of much the same thing. He cannot justify the process that has occurred here. He shields both himself and the Department of Finance, and once again now tries to argue that an in-consideration stage, a committee stage in the Senate here, is a reasonable substitute for a proper Senate inquiry. Well, that is a joke, and that you've convinced the Greens that that is a joke. So, Senator McDonald, let me remind you one element of that Senate inquiry. That Senate inquiry involved the Greens, Senator Rhiannon, side with the government 3 times to prevent the department from appearing. And do you know what the bigger joke to it was? She then asks questions of the AEC, and they said, "Oh, Senator, that's a political matter. You'd need to ask the department that." We will have lots of questions if we are forced to deal with this tonight for the department, and a very detailed consideration. If we are forced to go down the path of a proper inquiry in this chamber, we will do so. We have not had it. We have not had the Department of Finance appear before the Senate committee, and that's why this motion of the chair of the References Committee is appropriate. We should have this before the Finance and Public Administration Committee. But let me deal with some of the other shams. When we get to the committee stage, there'll be more. But the reason why this motion is pertinent is because several shams have arisen since we first dealt with the message. The first of those shams is the minister now saying, "We've already had 20 hours. We haven't had 20 hours in the second reading debate. We have not had 20 hours in the second reading debate, and you cannot argue debate in this place around the sham, confusion and chaos which is this government.
Point of order, Senator Cormann.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Senator Collins is misleading the chamber.
There is
no
reference
to
to
20 hours of debate since the message was
There is no point of order, Senator Cormann. Senator Collins, you have the call.
Thank you, Mr. President. The statement of fact I made is that there has not been 20 hours of a second reading consideration in relation to this bill. And other pretences from the minister, such as his perpetual reference to one Labor member as justification for the government's case, because he can't argue a sensible case. The reason we haven't had the department appear before the committee is because his own department can't argue that case. And when you look at the report of the sham committee process, do you know they even confect arguments for matters that aren't even on the public record to justify the position that the government has taken? Now, the detail of all of this, if we're forced, we will go into in minute detail during the committee stage consideration. And I will indeed have many, many questions through the minister for the department of matters that had not been addressed during the committee inquiry. I'll even deal with Senator Rhiannon's matters if she doesn't do so. We will ask the questions that need to be addressed. We will give this matter the proper scrutiny it should have. To pretend that a sham inquiry that wouldn't even allow the department to appear before members and senators so that we couldn't ask sensible questions about this legislation, to pretend that that's an appropriate consideration is a joke. But to then go on, as the Greens have too, and said, through legislation by attrition, we'll let you sit here forever to have a committee stage consideration, well, that's a joke too. That is as much of a joke as this morning was. The farce we saw this morning, where we have the Australian Greens saying we won't gag the consideration of electoral matters, but we will gag a conscience vote on same-sex marriage. How does that work? You're not even going to allow individual senators to speak in relation to a matter of conscience. Where on earth are the Greens coming from these days? Give me Bob Brown any day. He would not have perpetuated that joke. You cannot have a debate around an issue of conscience in this place and not allow any individual senator who wants to speak in the second reading to do so. It was a joke. But it is typical, because with the Greens we have the forked tongue I referred to yesterday. We have them saying one thing but doing something completely different. Now, Senator McDonald sits there nodding his head, but they're your partners now. They are your partners. They're the people you'll be sitting with right through tonight as you execute the sham that they have been convinced to join, the sham that they're too ignorant about process and procedure to understand what they've done.
Senator Collins. The time has expired. Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, this piece of legislation and its precursor have been through 2 full committee hearings. The first hearing went for many, many weeks. It was thoroughly investigated by every senator and member on that committee. And who were the senators on that committee? Who were the senators who took part in the not the majority report, the unanimous report recommending that this bill come forward? Unanimous. And the people on that committee, apart from Coalition and Green and Senator Xenophon, were Senator John Faulkner, Mr Gary Gray, Senator Tillum and Mr Alan Griffith, and 1 or 2 others as well. And they participated in this over a space of, I think it was, from memory, 4 or 5 weeks. We went all across Australia. We looked at everything. We inquired of everybody. We had the best evidence from the most senior academics to the person off the street. We looked at this and looked at this and looked at this. And how can anyone say we haven't had debate on this? Mr President, I understand that since the bill has come into this chamber, we've already had in excess of 20 hours of debate. 20 hours of debate, and we hear from Senator Collins that this is being rammed through without discussion. Of course, I remember in the dying days of the Labor government when 134 bills were put through this chamber by the then Labor government without so much as one word being spoken on them. One word. 134 different occasions was debate curtailed. Now, Mr President, 20 hours on any piece of legislation is a long time in anyone's language. Now, not only do we have 20 hours of the debate so far, we've had a debate in the other place as well. We've had the committee was recalled to look specifically at this legislation, and the committee at the time thoroughly investigated. And in fact, the committee was so thorough that it said to the government, "We don't quite like your bill, we don't think it's gone far enough. We, the committee, recommend there should be an addition to it." And fortuitously, the government have accepted the recommendation of that committee. That's how thoroughly the committee looked into it. We had answers from anybody we wanted them. We had all of the experts. And Senator Polly, you could have been there too had you been interested. I mean, I'm not on the committee, but under the rules we have in this place, senators can put themselves onto these joint committees as participating members. That's what I did. And I had all the rights and responsibilities of every member. I asked all the questions I wanted to. You weren't there, I don't think, Senator Polly. You weren't there, but you're saying a lot now. Why didn't you come along? If you have questions, you could have raised them there. 20 hours, more than 20 hours of debate so far, and the Labor Party would suggest to anyone who might be fooled by them, and there wouldn't be too many, but the Labor Party would suggest there's been no debate on this. Well, 20 hours of debate so far on this particular bill, and I anticipate, as the lead minister has said, that this will go for another 40 hours, and we're happy to sit here and debate it. But you know where it's going to end, and Look, I've been here for a while, many of you have, Senator Ludwig has. We know that there will come a stage when you'll all say, look, we know what the result's going to be. Why are we punishing ourselves sitting here to make a childish point? It's not even student politics, it's pupil politics. I think pupils are what go to primary schools, wasn't it? Because that's what will happen. It is pure childishness, 20 hours of debate already. Two committee hearings that thoroughly investigated every single aspect of this bill.
Two full committee hearings, and we're being told by the Labor Party there's been no debate. We haven't had a chance to look at it. What have you been doing in the last 20 hours if you haven't had the chance to investigate it? What have they been doing? I know what they've been doing. They've been attacking their old mates in the Greens all the time. That's what it's all been about.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Your time has expired. Senator Rhiannon.
Mr President, this amendment is not about an inquiry. The Labor senators might make it out it is. It's the latest attempt to derail Senate voting reform. That's what they've been doing. That is what they, and I'm happy to acknowledge your interjections, that's what Labor have been attempting to do. Two plans that they've had once Senate voting reform came forward. One is to derail the whole thing and the other to discredit the Greens, failing miserably on them both. But let's just look at what's going on with Labor here. They say they want an inquiry. Again, happy to acknowledge your interjections, but how deeply divided Labor are on this. Like, it is really extraordinary. Their own leaders, Mr Shorten, when he was questioned just this week about this very issue, and look at what he's had to say. He's asked the question, like, what would you do if you win the election? He said he appreciated being asked if he would win the election. He thought that was good. And then he said, so the actual question, so we can be exact, given that you have a problem with that, meaning Senate voting reform, if it does pass and you do win government, will you appeal or amend it? Simple question. Mr Shorten, in terms of what we do after the election, we accept the system. If it gets changed, has been changed, we'll see how it works. Now, I acknowledge he goes on to be critical of the system, but there he says it. We accept the system if it gets changed. Has been changed, we'll see how it works. Now, he's not alone. Remember Mr Faulkner. Former Senator Faulkner's comments on this are very informative.
Very good man, John Faulkner.
And one of his comments, when he spoke in this chamber about this very issue, in response to the report from the JSEM recommending Senate voting reform, he said, in practice this will mean the voters themselves will control the candidates and party groups who get their vote and their preferences. I would say that this reform is uncontroversial. His words. This reform is uncontroversial and is certainly overdue. And then he was speaking for Labor. Nobody here, and I noticed that Senators Conroy, Dastyari, Senators Wong, with all their vicious words, they're not down here, doing any of their heavy lifting. But at the time, Senator Faulkner spoke for Labor. He spoke for Labor very clearly. And one of the things that's been also very informative with this, again happy to acknowledge your interjections, what's been very informative in this debate is how insulting Senator Conroy has been of his own party. Quite extraordinary some of his comments have been, really putting the caucus and certain people in the caucus above the whole party. And he spelt that out very clearly, more than once in this debate, when it's come up that his party put in a submission, a very clear submission, to JSEM supporting Senate voting reform. And this came from ALP National Secretary George Wright. And he said Labor's preferred position would also see a requirement the ballot paper's instructions and how to vote material advocate that voters fill in a minimum number of boxes above the line. He had also spelled out very clearly the group voting tickets must be abolished. Again, very clear support for Senate voting reform. Very clear, and I acknowledge the comment from the Greens leader, Senator Di Natale. Very similar, because then we were working together. And what's going on here now is the a few Labor senators, and it is only a few Labor senators, happy to acknowledge, are trying to derail it. They talk about sham, they talk about advantage. They are the ones who are looking for advantage here. So this, again to repeat, this is to listeners who may have just come in. What we are about to vote on is not about a real inquiry to help advance Senate voting reform. We've had the experience for New South Wales since 1999. 4 elections with upper house voting reform, very similar to what we have here. Small parties have been elected, there's been no complaints, we've got the proof in practice, we've got so many experts backing this, and there's just a few Labor senators in a very destructive way to their own party, I would say causing problems to the leader of the Labor Party, certainly Former Minister and former Shadow on this issue, Gary Gray, has spelled it out very clearly. This is not a good day for Labor. They are being exposed for the very destructive way that they can operate, not in the best interests, the interests of the common good for Australia and the interests of democracy. Thank you, Mr President.
Thank you, Senator Rhiannon. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, Mr President, what a remarkable scene we're witnessing.
Order, Senator Birmingham. Point of order, Senator Polley.
Yes. I believe that you need to come back to this side. You had the government, then you went to Rhiannon, and now you've gone back to the government again.
Well,
For
order.
and against. For
Order.
and against.
I don't need everyone to be involved in this. Order. On the point of order, Senator Di Natale.
I just remind Senator Polley that it is Senator Rhiannon, not Rhiannon.
Thank you very much, Senator Di Natale. Senator Polley, in relation to your point of order, Senator Dastiari. It's disorderly to interject, especially when you're not in your seat. In relation to the point of order, Senator Polley, it's practice to go from side to side in the chamber. The debate commenced with the Labor Party. It went to the government, back to the Labor Party, back to the government, then to the crossbench. If an independent senator had stood, I would have gone there next, but then back to the government. So, Senator Birmingham, you have the call.
Thanks, Mr President. Well, what a remarkable act of hypocrisy we're witnessing from those opposite. And I appreciate they don't want to be called out for it. They don't want to be called out for the hypocrisy we're seeing here today. But of course it is quite remarkable. Not just the substance of their argument, but of course also the mere fact that they are having this argument to go off to an inquiry. And the fact that it is Senator McAllister who is here moving this motion is most remarkable of all. As Senator Cormann— you say why? Well, a very good question you ask. Senator Cormann highlighted the fact that Senator McAllister took Senator Faulkner's seat, an advocate of the very reforms we're bringing here. But more importantly, Mr President, Senator Rhiannon just referenced, quite rightly, the ALP's submission to the JSCEM inquiry, signed off by George Wright, National Secretary. Guess who, Mr President? Guess who the National President of the Australian Labor Party was when this submission was lodged? Senator McAllister! Senator McAllister was heading up the federal executive of the Labor Party that authorised this submission, this fine submission, this upstanding submission from the Australian Labor Party. This submission dated 24th of April 2014, a mere 2 years ago it was, Mr President. Let me read some more from this submission because it is so outstanding. The manipulation of group voting tickets are a central reason that candidates with little public support have seen themselves elected to the Australian Senate. Without group voting tickets, the capacity of these candidates to deliver sufficient preferences through a coordinated preference harvesting strategy would not exist. Very strong arguments against group voting tickets. Very strong arguments for the exact legislation before this chamber that Senator McAllister now seeks to delay. Of course, Mr Wright, who was answering to Senator McAllister at that time 2 years ago, went on, and I quote, "In the specific circumstances of the current Senate voting system, where group voting tickets are so blatantly being abused to frustrate the democratic will of electors, even the normally undesirable effect of optional preferential voting, which leads to a significant number of votes exhausting, may be the lesser of two evils." Then, of course, Mr Wright went on to read the very quote, to put the very statement that Senator Rhiannon read. The argument in favour precisely of the precise reforms we have brought to this chamber. Reforms that require votes above the line to be dictated at the preference of the elector. For there to be more than one box to be filled out. For there to be a savings provision, though, if somebody only fills out the one box. All of the measures in the legislation that Senator Cormann brings to this chamber and that has been the subject of much scrutiny. How much scrutiny, you might ask? Well, let's go back and have a look at the Joint Standing Committee inquiry that the submission of Senator McAllister of the Australian Labor Party was made to. because it was a very long inquiry, you know, Mr President. When they come here and say they want more inquiry time, let's look back, because that inquiry had 21 hearings. 21 hearings it had. 21 hearings. Those hearings were held over a period of time from February 2014 to March 2015. 13 months of inquiry there was, 13 months of hearings. 13 months of hearings that resulted in recommendations that we have put into legislation, that you supported those recommendations, and yet now you seek to frustrate it. Now the Australian Labor Party, having put a submission to an inquiry 2 years ago asking for these reforms, having participated in 13 months of hearings, 21 different hearings, comes here and says, now we've changed our mind and we don't want it. Well, Mr President, the most hypocritical, the most petulant behaviour I've seen in 9 years in the Senate I see from those opposite at present. The most hypocritical, petulant behaviour I've ever seen in this place. And why? Because they are simply standing up for backroom operators, for preference whisperers, and standing against the democratic will of the Australian voter. We on this side are proud to say that we trust voters to direct their preferences. We don't think that backroom operators should direct the voters' will. We think voters should direct their preferences as they see fit. That is exactly what our legislation will determine. We are proud of it, and you should be ashamed of yourselves for your hypocritical backflip.
Thank you, Senator Birmingham. The question now is that the motion moved by Senator McAllister under Standing Order 115 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the noes have it. Division required, ring the bells. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion moved by Senator McAllister under Standing Order 115 be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator McEwen, teller for the ayes, Senator Fawcett, teller for the noes. Order. There being 24 ayes and 35 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative.
Is it the wish of the committee that the bill be taken as a whole? There being no objection, it is so ordered. The question is that the bill stand as printed. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. As I indicated in that brief moment we had earlier in addressing some of the arguments for why this bill hasn't been adequately considered, I indicated that it's very unfortunate that a proper consideration of a piece of legislation with the significance of this, a major change that hasn't occurred in 30 years in terms of how we elect senators. I indicated that there will be many areas of questions arising from the poor consideration that had occurred. And I intend at the outset to highlight a number of those areas. For example, I think I said in that 5-minute statement, when I had the opportunity to review the Hansard of the very brief hearing we had. In fact, let me take this moment to go to that point, because I was reminded by one of my colleagues, in fact Senator Moore, but also others during that division, that of course the report that Senator Birmingham was referring to, but I see he's now left the chamber, was a very brief interest. Oh, he's here. Good. Where is he? Oh, very good. Senator Birmingham. Now, Senator Birmingham, the interim report on the inquiry into the conduct of the 2013 federal election covered many issues. And to maintain the pretence that that was an adequate consideration of the issues that this government has done a fix with the Greens behind closed doors to create this bill, and even when I say create this bill, of course, you've got to look at what this bill is once you wade through 4 explanatory memorandums, because it's shifted because of the farce of process that occurred in its creation. But I would like to remind the Senate that the genesis of the considerations that the minister refers to when he tries to misrepresent Labor's position, the genesis was the joint parliamentary committee's consideration of the conduct of the 2013 federal election. So let me remind senators of what some of the issues in the conduct of that election were, because they're quite pertinent to what we will deal with during the course of what, unfortunately for senators, will be a very lengthy committee stage consideration of a bill. We would rather it occurred another way. We would rather it didn't involve senators staying here in the chamber day and night to address these matters, but we will not leave these matters unaddressed. So, in the very brief inquiry we had, whilst we had the AEC, and let me remind senators of how that process worked. I think Senator Conroy had at least 2, maybe 3 turns of 5 minutes of questions. Senator McDonald describes that as an adequate inquiry. Labor had 2 or 3 goes of 5-minute questions, and in fact, when I sought to clarify a point, the chair tried to rule me out during Labor senators' time. Fortunately, the chair was subsequently reminded that it was Labor's time according to his own rules, as limited as those rules were, and that Senator Conroy was happy to cede to my request, again, that the department appear so that we could ask them questions. But I stray from the main point. And the main point is, if you go back to the interim report on the inquiry into the conduct of the 2013 federal election, you go back to what those issues were. Now, do senators recall what problems the AEC had at that point? They weren't just the issues over micro-parties. There were serious problems with how the election had been conducted. And this was why, when the AEC appeared before the committee farce, this is why when the AEC was there, they were very keen to stress that they needed at least 3 months to implement the changes that were before the committee at that stage. Now, we don't know yet. Hopefully the minister will be able to enlighten us during the course of this discussion, but we don't know yet what the AEC's view is with respect to the implementation of the further amendments to the bill. We don't know that. The AEC may feel actually they require further time because the government has now proposed to make more significant changes. We don't know. Hopefully the minister might be able to enlighten us here on what consideration has occurred since the government considered JSCEM's recommendations. And that, of course, will be another area that I'll come to, because I would like to understand, after we went through that farce of a process where we were required to consider the inquiry in such a limited time frame, I would like to understand what subsequently occurred within government. Because, unfortunately, we have things such as the committee inquiry report, where we are told by government senators, I think Senator Rhiannon might have signed on to this one too, we are told that first up, in the interim report, JSCEM had been concerned about logos on ballot papers. They were concerned that they hadn't had the opportunity to assess the associated copyright and printing ramifications. But the committee went on through some process of imagination, because there wasn't any material before us. Maybe these members of the committee were party to some process we didn't have an opportunity to participate on, but the reflection of the majority of the committee there is that we're pleased that these issues have been addressed to the government's satisfaction. How do we know that? There was no discussion before the committee of that point. The department didn't appear before the committee on that point. So we go back to an issue that had been highlighted in the interim report on the inquiry into the conduct of the 2013 federal election, the implications of including logos on ballot papers. And what do we find? We find even the majority of the committee says, we hadn't had an opportunity to assess the associated copyright and printing ramifications. Now, in reality, what this report should have said, and we still haven't considered it, but instead what it said somehow something happened that implanted this idea because there was no evidence, there weren't submissions that covered these points before the committee, but suddenly the committee is pleased that these issues have been addressed to the government's satisfaction. As far as I can see, the discussions in the 4 explanatory memorandums don't cover this point. So where did it come from? It's a sham. It seriously is a sham. There will be concerns about how logos will be used. We don't know what processes ultimately the AEC will apply. I've previously made the point that you may have political parties who aren't quite as proud of their logo as the Australian Greens, who may actually feel under these new rules it's appropriate to change their logo. Will there be sufficient time to do that? Will the AEC facilitate that process? We don't know. But of course that's not the only thing we don't know. The other things we don't know that I was referring to earlier on behalf of Senator Rhiannon, because she was really concerned about this policy issue. On the Hansard, Senator Rhiannon asked the AEC, let me go to that question, because this is another one where we really don't know what the implications here might be. Senator Rhiannon asked the AEC, as you know, there is a requirement in the bill that people should number a minimum of 1 to 6 boxes. She asked the AEC, should there be a penalty for anyone advocating to just vote 1 above the line? Now, quite rightly and predictably, the AEC said, oh, that's a matter of policy, that's a matter for government. But can you imagine? This bill's already been through the House. By virtue of a deal done between the Greens and the government, it's already been through a process where they've made further amendments, as commentators have said, what? Are you serious? It's already been through that stage, and now we're in the Senate inquiry, and we've got Senator Rhiannon asking a really basic policy question. A basic policy question that should have been considered in the discussions that the Greens had with the government. But even more astounding is that we should be able to find a policy response to that question. Now, the AEC was the wrong place to go to ask, but maybe that explains why Senator Rhiannon sidled up with the government members of the committee and prevented a very reasonable request, attempted 3 times, for the committee to have the opportunity to question the department. She herself needed to question the department because you can't find the answer to that question when you look at the bill, you look at the explanatory memorandum, you look at the government first and second reading speeches. The answer to that basic question is not there. Now, the other questions that were asked in the committee inquiry covered things such as what modelling had the AEC, or was the AEC aware that the government had conducted? Now, at least according to the AEC, there wasn't any. So we really don't know the implications of even just that basic question that Senator Lee Rhiannon asked. We don't know whether there should be a penalty for someone advocating to just vote 1 above the line. We don't know how many people might just vote 1 above the line under the new arrangements. We haven't seen any mapping or any indication of what consideration government has applied. We've seen lots of signs, which I'll come to later, about what a farce this process has been. In fact, I would have to suggest it's been the most astounding government consideration process that I think I've seen in 20 years in the Senate. And that we struggle so hard to find any description of what the government's policy rationale is incredible. Now, partly it's incredible because it's been through a process with the Australian Greens where that hasn't been required. Now, perhaps if the government had gone through the proper process and had sought to engage all participants in the Senate, then they would have been challenged to provide adequate policy rationale. But unfortunately, in the backdoor discussions with the Australian Greens, it seems that that challenge didn't occur. And then what else didn't occur, which is an example of the inexperience or the ineptitude of, let me be generous and say both parties, is the poor consideration of what process might need to follow. Because without a lack of a policy rationale and without some sense of what process you're then going to undergo, we end up in this chaos. Now, I will be generous to the Greens here because opposite me is the government of the day. It's actually their job to have a sense of how they want to progress their agenda. But instead, we have the chaos that is this. And why do we have that? We have that because they've driven down this tunnel, sort of thinking they want a double dissolution, sort of thinking they only want a double dissolution if they can change the way the Senate works, sort of thinking they want the ABC, but, oh, oops, we don't know when we're going to have a time or opportunity to deal with that. And their whole management of procedure in this place has been fraught. So, of all the scams, the most recent of those was, of course, Senator Cormann's description of, oh, and we had it from Senator Birmingham too, but he was just trotting out the earlier lines, the 20 hours. There's been 20 hours debate of this. What a fraud. This bill has been before the Senate when we commenced the second reading. Because you've been caught up in a sham of a process and haven't managed the process appropriately, it hasn't proceeded in the way it might normally. If there had been an appropriate attempt to engage in an open and transparent process with all senators, cross-party, Greens, opposition and government, it's strange how easily legislation then does progress. You won't have arguments about whether we should receive messages and how they should be managed. You won't have debates about what a fraud the committee inquiry was. And you won't have protracted, lengthy committee stage considerations where all the matters that should be addressed by the department or the government—
Your time has expired. So the question is, Senator Moore?
Deputy President, I'm not sure. Would you like me to move, Senator?
No, I'm happy for you to
Thank
speak
you. It's
from
just
either
too difficult.
position. Senator Moore.
Just a couple of points, Mr Deputy President. In terms of the arguments we heard in that previous discussion around taking to a committee or not, some of the claims being made by members of the government about the extensive consultation that had been done and the number of hours and the number of meetings that had gone around the legislation. It's always difficult because I know that when you get excited and you're wanting to put forward your particular point of view, it sometimes is tempting to actually over-exaggerate the actual statements that you're making. And on the particular issue of the number of hours spent in the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, I am not a member of that Joint Standing Committee, but in preparation for this I managed to go through the website and have a look at the process that was undertaken from December 2013, when Senator Ronaldson actually referred the conduct of the 2013 election to the Joint Standing Committee, as happens after every committee, a standard process. And the number of hours and the papers being waved around by Senator Birmingham in particular about how many hours and how many meetings took place to consider, as he said, this issue of Senate voting was highly inflated. In fact, the agenda items that the Joint Standing Committee looked at were the range of issues that were part of the 2013 election, and they range from things such as electronic voting. In fact, a whole segment of the hearings that allegedly Senator Birmingham felt were concentrated exclusively on the issue of Senate voting were not. there was a very serious series of meetings and inquiry discussions and processes that looked particularly at the issue of electronic voting. And one of the interim reports concentrated on that. And a very interesting report it was around the issues of electronic voting, raising a number of issues that were put forward by submissions and looked at processes into the future. The recommendations from that element were that at this stage it was not appropriate to proceed with this area. And that is fine. That's a process that the committee takes. But there was, and I haven't counted the hours, Mr Deputy President, maybe someone would have the time to actually go through and count how many hours of this Joint Standing Committee process was taken on each particular issue, how many of the submissions covered what issue, and what the focus of the Australian Electoral Commission were during the debate around this process. I haven't done that. But what I have done is I've looked at the reports and I've seen that whilst the issues around Senate voting processes were a significant issue in the overall discussion of the Joint Standing Committee, it was not the only focus. And to come into this debate and as part of making a strong argument, and in fact, Senator Collins, one of the expressions my mother used to use was one that was said, someone over-egged the custard. And I think the custard was flowing strongly in some of the debate that we've heard, and I would expect we'll continue to hear, Mr Deputy President. But I think it's important that at least we lay down some of the processes around making sure that we keep a reasonable approach. And I'm wanting to put on record the work that I've done in terms of looking at what the Joint Standing Committee did. People who are listening to this debate won't have the time or possibly the interest in going through and checking out the veracity of the statements that are being made in the argument. But what I strongly believe around this issue, which, as we've known, is the biggest single change to the way that the Senate voting process will operate in many years, I figure 30 years, I believe, since the last major change occurred, there is a need for strong consideration, element by element, about what is the most effective way to take this forward. And I certainly do have some questions through you, Mr Deputy President, to the Minister about getting some information about the education process, which was strongly recommended by the Australian Electoral Commission and also the Joint Standing Committee about what would be needed should there be a change in the way this would operate, the fact that there would need to be a strong education process put in place to work with the community to make them aware of the changes and how they would operate. That would be a standard process, I think, if we're making changes, but particularly if we're making changes to an already complex system. And I think many people have already raised in the discussion we've had so far, and I don't know whether they're 20 hours, Minister. I think there's been a significant amount of discussion since the bill came into this place. What hasn't happened in the debate in this place is the opportunity to hear from other people about how they feel. And in terms of this particular bill, the first time this particular bill was placed under any scrutiny as a piece of legislation was the 4-hour process that we had 2 weeks ago, where Senator Collins has already described the process. I read it. I didn't have the opportunity to attend because I was at another committee. I'm sorry if Senator McDonald is listening. I'm sorry. That does not indicate that I had a lack of interest in the issues of the electoral reform, as he seemed to infer that anyone who didn't turn up for the actual hearing was not interested in the process. It was just that there were other responsibilities to be had. But I did read the Hansard of that hearing, and I saw that because of the time constraints, and clearly even the chair of that hearing said there were time constraints, there was very strong restrictions to how many questions people could ask, and also a sequential nature of the way the people could be engaged in the process. Understandably, if you're having a 4-hour hearing, that's the kind of thing that if you had a clear, focused committee process around the piece of legislation itself, there would be a wider opportunity for senators to ask questions, to follow up questions, to be involved in debate. That was not offered on this piece of legislation. That is, in fact, one of the faults that I see in the process. We can talk here about how long the issues of Senate electoral reform have been on the agenda. We can talk about how many hours the Joint Standing Committee actually looked at this particular issue. But what we cannot say is that the piece of legislation that came out of the Joint Standing Committee process, no one debates that. The piece of legislation did come out of the Joint Standing Committee process, but that piece of legislation has not been subject to the standard scrutiny that this chamber expects in terms of new legislation that's been brought forward. What we have had is, up till now, and I think it will continue, debate in the chamber. So that's people with various points of view standing up and giving that evidence into the debate. That has happened. No one can challenge that. In fact, there's been more hours in us giving our opinions of the bill than in finding out what other people thought about it and giving questions to experts in the process. No one can challenge that. If we'd had a 20 or 25-hour process of looking at the bill in a committee, that would then have been giving the chance. I think I put in my contribution this afternoon, I think there was about 110, 112 submissions to the 4-hour process. Most of those submissions, individuals, quite short submissions, considering they had 3 days to put their submission in, who felt strongly enough to say, this is how I feel about the process. Many of them were distressed. By looking through them, many of them were distressed about the process in which we were engaged because they felt it was being rushed. And in fact, one that I will not read the person's name into Hansard, but you'll find it in one of the submissions to the 4-hour inquiry chat discussion, which said that this does not give value to the way the Senate should operate, that this very rushed process is not a reflection of how we should operate. So, Mr Deputy President, my point is that you cannot say that this bill has been the subject to extensive scrutiny by this chamber. You cannot say this bill has been the subject of extensive scrutiny by this Joint Standing Committee, and you certainly can't say that the series of reports that are on the web page that reflect what did occur as a result of the Joint Standing Committee review of the 2013 election, you cannot say that those documents were fully focused on Senate electoral reform. That's just not true. And to purport that that is factual actually weakens the argument. If we are going to talk about what is appropriate consultation, let's talk about how the process has operated up till now. So it would seem to me a simple challenge for this chamber. How are we going to be able to get the answers to the questions that some of us have about how it will work, how the process will operate, who's been consulted, all the things that Senator Collins was saying that was the hope that we would have in a formal committee process that was looking at the legislation, allowing then for more amendments if required. We did have, and even as a result of that short discussion, there came to be amendments brought forward into this place. Those amendments weren't there before we even had that level of scrutiny. I believe that we'd had further opportunity to have more extensive scrutiny, have more evidence provided by those people who are genuinely interested in the process of electoral law in our country. If we'd given a further opportunity for people to scrutinise the options in front of us, to scrutinise what had occurred between when the original evidence was taken at the number of inquiries that the Joint Standing Committee had, been able to listen to various opinions that were raised after those interim reports had been brought forward, because, as all of us would acknowledge, the Joint Standing Committee was doing its work scrupulously through that period of 2014 and 2015, as Senator Birmingham said earlier. They were working really hard and presenting us with quite detailed reports about what they had done. But was any of that brought back into this chamber? No. No. For between 2015 and 2 weeks ago, there was no discussion in this place around electoral reform, and that is a fault. And we should be able to be, And said, I take that report, that contribution, Senator Rhiannon. When was the report from the Joint Standing Committee debated in this place between 2015 and here? Done. And you could check the Hansard on that process, and I am actually happy to have that discussion. It is good to have some elements of our Senate and the House of Reps involved in these discussions. That's why we have joint standing committees operating. But the next step of that kind of consideration is coming back into this place and having discussion in this place about what happens next. That did not occur between April 2015 and 2 weeks ago. Now, if these things need to be considered fully, and if we are going to recommend that there are such significant changes to our process, we need to have those discussions in this chamber. And we did not have that until 2 weeks ago. And I believe that that is a serious fault, and that raises, as I've said earlier in this discussion, in this debate, that raises questions about why it was not urgent in April 2015 and it's suddenly urgent in March 2016. And that is where I think that we need to seriously look at our process. What will happen in this debate will happen. And it will go on, and there'll be lots of people making contributions and raising points and putting arguments as to why change should happen or not. And that is how the process operates. But when this happens again, when we actually have a joint standing committee on electoral matters looking at issues around the election of 2014 and we know 2016, and we know there will be one, we will have an election in 2016, and we will have the extraordinarily hard-working Joint Standing Committee working on these issues with the people from the AEC who professionally look at the process. We should continue to have the discussions back in this place so that these issues, quite viable issues about why processes should change, electoral process should change, electronic voting should change, that all that wealth of information should come back into the Senate, so we should be able to consider it. And now, during the night of the 17th St Patrick's Day 2017, we will be trying in that period of time to conduct a formal inquiry about what happened around the issues only of electoral voting in the Senate, rather than looking at all the issues of the election of 2013.
Oh, very good.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Chair. Chair, a number of inaccurate assertions have been made by the two speakers in the committee debate so far. The suggestion that this legislation is being rushed is blatantly false. It is, of course, well understood that this bill implements the unanimous recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which were first released in May 2014. And that committee had some very significant Labor luminaries on it. Not just anybody, two, not one, two former special ministers of state, two former Labor ministers, cabinet ministers, who were looking after the electoral matters, electoral policy. Not just Mr. Gray, but also then Senator John Faulkner. Now I know that Senator Collins doesn't like to hear this, and she likes to continue to rudely interrupt. I didn't interrupt Senator Collins at all. I listened to her in silence. But nevertheless, let me just again remind Senator Collins then, and I will do this, I suspect, on a number of occasions tonight, that Mr. Gray this morning said that these reforms, which are in front of the Senate, implement 95% of the reforms that were recommended by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. 95%. And let me also say, because Mr. Gray is not alone when it comes to the Labor Party, there are other senior Labor luminaries who actually share his views. Today, on Sky News, the former Premier of Queensland, from Senator Moore's home state of Queensland, Mr. Beattie. Remember Mr. Beattie? OK, here's what Mr. Beattie says. I think Gary Gray's comments are right on Senate reform. Frankly, I don't agree with the Labor Party's position on this. Senate reform is important. The Labor Party under Mr Shorten's leadership is out of step with the respected opinion of senior Labor people across the country, because everybody in Australia knows that the only reason why Bill Shorten decided to ignore the considered advice of people like Mr Gray and former Senator Faulkner, people like Peter Beattie, people like former ACTU President Jenny George and former member in the House of Representatives, the only reason is because he did not have the courage to stand up to the bullying tactics of people like Senator Conroy and various interests in the union movement. That is what it is. He didn't want to pick the fight. He knew, Mr Shorten knows in his heart of hearts that what we are doing here today is right. And hence the comments that he made in a doorstop earlier this week that Senator Rhiannon read into the chamber earlier, where he says that he actually accepts the system. And if it is changed, he'll keep the system. He knows that what we're doing is right. He's just humouring people like Senator Stephen Conroy, like Senator Dastyari, like the sort of union heavies that come into his office in and out every day, because he doesn't want to pick the fight. He doesn't have the guts to pick the fight with them, even though it would be required in order to stand up in the national interest. Now, people say that we're rushing these reforms. Now, on the 6th of February 2016, this is what Mr Gray, the then Shadow Minister for Electoral Matters, the then Shadow Minister representing the Labor Party, the spokesperson for the Labor Party dealing with Senate electoral reform, the person that I was talking to as the person for the government, as the person responsible for this area for the government, I was talking to Mr Gray as the person responsible for the Labor Party. He was my talking partner in order to ascertain Labor's position, in order to ascertain whether there was opportunity for common ground, in order to ascertain the best way forward. And he published an opinion piece in the West Australian on the 6th of February saying the system, the Senate voting system needs to be fixed. Fixing the Senate voting system is as important as one vote, one value, and it is as important as a franchise. And then he talks about the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. These recommendations would give the power to allocate preferences back to voters and stop opaque preference swaps between parties. More specifically, under the recommended optional preferential voting system, voters would be able to expressly preference parties or candidate groups above the line rather than having their preferences distributed for them under a registered group voting ticket. And then he says, these changes will mean voter intention is reflected in a democratic electoral outcome. They will give voters control over whom they do and do not vote for. These reforms are not intended to stifle or prevent the formation of new parties. They simply mean that political parties, including my own, will have to convince the public, rather than backroom deal-makers, that they deserve their votes. And here comes the clinger. Here comes the clinger. The final sentence in that opinion piece, the final sentence, the government should act now without delay and before the next election. That is the person who at the time was the appointed Labor spokesperson for Senate electoral reform. He was the person who was speaking for the Labor Party. He was the person that I was talking to as the spokesperson for the Labor Party. And now they're all saying, oh, well, no, he was on a frolic of his own. That was never supported by the Labor Party. But Senator Birmingham has already read out the extracts from the submission of the National Secretary of the Labor Party complaining about the manipulation of group voting tickets as a central reason that candidates with little public support have seen themselves elected to the Australian Senate. He's already read out the quotes from the National Secretary of the Labor Party, George Wright, that Labor's preferred position would also see a requirement that ballot paper instructions and how to vote material advocate that voters fill in a minimum number of boxes above the line, precisely what we're doing, while still counting as formal any ballot paper with at least a 1 above the line. Precisely 100% what this bill is doing. Now, Mr Gray is not the only one urging us to get on with it. Mr Griffin, on the 18th of April 2015, he was then, as he is now, still now, the Deputy Chair, Labor Deputy Chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. This is what he said in April last year, nearly a year ago. The government should be acting on these recommendations, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommendations, and if they're going to, they need to hurry up, because they're running out of time. And here we've got the Labor, after all these Labor luminaries have been out there saying to the government, get on with it, let's do it, it's important, we need to fix this. Here we are putting a proposal to the Senate which is 95%, according to the Labor Shadow Cabinet Minister Gary Gray, 95% of what was recommended on Senate voting reform. And Labor says, no. Let's just wait for another 6 months. Let's just do it later. Well, the truth is we could have an inquiry that lasts for another 5 years. If Bill Shorten is the leader with people like Senator Conroy and Senator Dastyari pulling his strings, the Labor Party will never change their mind in relation to what is a good public policy position. Now, it's again been suggested how this legislation is so dramatically different from what the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommended back in 2014, some 2 years ago. Let me take you through it. Let me take you through the individual recommendations and explain to you precisely what is similar and what is different. So the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommended optional preferential voting above the line full stop. So that would have meant that people could have just filled in one above the line without any guidance or instruction or advice to fill in at least 6 boxes from 1 to 6 in order of their preference. Now, we've decided to do the latter. Instead of going with the original Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommendation to just put one and to advise to just put one, we're going with the advice on the ballot paper that to vote above the line, a voter needs to complete at least 1 to 6, but with a savings provision that 1 or fewer than 6 is still formal. So the position that we've adopted is more consistent with the submission that the National Secretary of the Labor Party put to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. Like, yes, we have departed from what was recommended, by JSCAM. We're not strictly adopting their position, but our position is actually more consistent with the Labor Party position put to that committee at the time. I mean, I would have thought that the Labor Party would have congratulated us for the fact that we were taking on board the suggestions of the National Secretary of the Labor Party. I would have thought that in particular Senator McAllister, the National President of the Labor Party at the time when Labor made that submission, would have congratulated us for having taken that on board and for the fact that the Coalition and the Greens thought, yes, George Wright is right on this and we take on board what he's saying, and that is, of course, exactly what we've done. Now, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommended in relation to below-the-line voting, partial, optional, preferential voting, with preferences to be completed equal to the number of vacancies, 6, 12 or 2. Now, the government, and this is not hard to understand, the government has accepted the subsequent recommendation of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters that in order to vote below the line, the advice on the ballot paper should encourage the voter to number at least 1 to 12, but with a savings provision that any ballot paper where at least 1 to 6 boxes are filled in sequentially from 1 to 6 in order of their preference is still formal. Again, it's not complicated. I mean, you agree, you disagree. It is a slight variation on what was recommended, but is extremely close. The JSCAM, the Joint Standing Committee, recommended the abolition of group and individual voting tickets. We are abolishing through this bill group and individual voting tickets. The JSCAM recommended, the Joint Standing Committee recommended additional resources to the AEC to educate voters on changes. We have already publicly indicated, and the AEC told the most recent inquiry, that the government is providing additional resources for that purpose. Now, then, there were a range of recommendations in that interim report that was released in May 2014 to increase various membership requirements, membership numbers, verification, compliance, etc., etc. And I guess the context to this, the background to this, is the level of gaming that took place where members of one party set up another party, and another party, and another party, and where officers, the same members of one party, were officers of several parties and negotiating preferences with themselves through group voting ticket arrangements, which was completely misleading. It was completely misleading for voters that were not clear on who they were actually voting for when they were voting for one of these pop-up parties, which was channeling preferences in all sorts of directions. So what we've decided here, there's only one change that we've adopted, though, out of those recommendations, and that is that a public officer for a registered officer for a political party should not be able to be a public officer a registered officer for several parties. We would have thought that's sensible. I mean, it's a complete conflict for you to be the public officer of two different parties. Senator Leinhelm appeared as a witness at the inquiry. He said if he'd had the time, he would have set up 20 different parties with various names, the No Carbon Tax Party, the No This Party, the No Cigarette Taxes Party, the No That Party, because the name of the party being a slogan to attract some primary votes, which were then channeled after they negotiated with themselves on how they can channel these preferences through group voting tickets. I mean, is that really the way we should elect senators to this chamber? Really? Is that really what the Labor Party believes? So no, we are actually making that change that was recommended by JSCAM. Now, we weren't able to reach consensus with the Greens, and I'm quite open and candid about this. The government's preference would have been to accept the recommendation, which would have required an increase in membership requirement from the 500 or so that it is at present to 1,500. In the end, we had to make a judgment on what was realistically achievable through this chamber, so the government compromised. The government accepted that the Greens would not support this, and given that the Labor Party, nobody knew where the Labor Party was going to be in relation to any of this, because by then the Labor Party was in chaos and in complete dysfunction. Their shadow spokesperson was expressing one view, and people here in the Senate were expressing a different view, so it was very hard to actually know what the Labor Party position was. There was a recommendation from JSCAM that we should require candidates to be resident in the state or territory in which they were seeking election, because the proposition being that if you haven't got enough support in the state that you can't even attract a candidate in that state, you shouldn't be able to run a candidate. Now, initially, we considered adopting that recommendation, but we received legal advice that that would highly likely to be found to be unconstitutional. So we did not proceed with that recommendation because the eligibility requirements for election to this place are provided for in the Senate. Now I'm taking you through it quite logically. And finally, while there was no specific Joint Standing Committee Electoral Matters recommendation in relation to party logos, the Joint Standing Committee did point out that there was a problem of potential voter confusion with similar party names, and that the government should consider ways to address this. And our proposal to allow political parties at their discretion to have their logo included on the ballot paper is our attempt at minimising voter confusion when you have political parties of similar names presenting themselves for election. So the government has very much constructively and positively taken on board the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee. We have consulted subsequent to that, including with the Labor Party. Through the official spokesperson of the Labor Party on electoral matters, we have gone in good faith through a very thorough process, and the bill that is in front of the Senate today is the result of that process.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'd like to thank the Minister for moving on after 10 minutes of his Labor luminary talking points. I mean, I could stand here and do Liberal luminary talking points and waste the time of senators, but I'm not going to do that. But let's get to some of the key matters that he just did start addressing in part. So the Minister told us that in some respects they considered the report. He sort of shifted a bit between the JSCAM 2014 report and what I understand to be the JSCAM 2016 report. So I'm wondering if the Minister could inform the committee on when exactly the government did consider the recommendations of the 2016 report.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Well, we considered them obviously after they were tabled.
Senator Urquhart.
I draw the Chair's attention to the state of the chamber.
Quorum not present. Ring the bells. Quorum present. Order. Senator Collins.
Thank you. Given the response I just got to that last question, I'd ask the Minister when did he first consider the recommendations of the 2016 JSCAM report?
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and I thank Senator Collins. Well, I first considered the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters 2016 report after that report was tabled. But obviously, on the day that the hearing took place, it won't surprise you that rather than to attend the Coalition Joint Party Room meeting, I was glued to my television watching the evidence that was given by some very distinguished Australians, including people like Anthony Green and others. And obviously I had some conversations with a number of experts in this space. And as I was considering the evidence that was being given in public session, certainly I started to think that maybe there was a further way that a very good bill could be further improved. And after some further consultation with some key stakeholders in the Parliament, after the Joint Standing Committee 2016 recommendations had been tabled, I decided to recommend to the Government, in my capacity as the Special Minister of State, that we should develop and initiate a further set of amendments, which of course I have since publicly flagged and which were circulated in the Chamber some 10 or 11 days ago, and which reminds me that I should table a supplementary explanatory memorandum relating to the government amendments to be moved to this bill, which I now do.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, did you receive advice from your department in relation to the recommendations of the JSCAM 2016 report? And if so, when?
Minister.
Self-evidently, I sought and received advice in relation to the amendments that the government has initiated and circulated, and in relation to which I've just tabled an additional explanatory memorandum.
Senator Collins.
Chair, the problem is that this is not self-evident, and the minister is deliberately being very vague in his responses. So I'll try a different question, which is, Minister, did you receive advice or consult the Secretary of your department in relation to the recommendations of the JSCAM report, and if so, when?
Minister.
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
Senator Collins.
It's going to be a long night. It's a pretty straightforward question. The Secretary of your department, Ms Halton, I believe, did you consult her as one of the people you indicated that you consulted following the JSCAM Committee's 2016 recommendations?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Not me personally. If I'm not sure what Senator Collins is getting at, we followed the usual standard procedure in relation to these matters. The government was inclined to pursue a particular change to the bill that had been introduced into the Parliament and passed by the House of Representatives. We communicated our intention in the usual way to the relevant people in the department. Relevant advice was sought and provided, and of course the amendments were drafted, which have since been circulated.
Senator Collins.
Well, the problem, Chair, is that the minister talks about the usual way, and what would usually happen in terms of a committee recommendation in relation to legislation is that the minister would seek advice from his department. The minister has told us that he sought advice from, if I'm correct in my recollection of what he said, some colleagues, and that's about the best description we've got of what government consideration occurred at this moment in terms of the JSCAM Committee's 2016 recommendations. So let me put part of that in the broader picture. The broader picture is I don't believe the government's responded to the 2014 JSCAM Committee report. Am I accurate there?
Minister.
Well, I think everybody across Australia would be of the view that the government has responded by virtue of the proposal that we have put in front of the Parliament for the Parliament's consideration. Indeed, when the Prime Minister and I announced the proposed improvements to Senate voting arrangements, we very clearly indicated at that time that this was our response to the unanimous recommendations of a cross-party committee of the Parliament, which, with relevant expertise in relation to these matters, namely the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters report released on the 9th of May 2014.
Senator Collins.
Well, Chair, again we go back to usual process because the government didn't table before the Senate a response. In fact, it didn't table before the House a response. So, as Senator Moore was pointing out, there hasn't been an opportunity to canvass before the Parliament the government's view about the appropriate response to that 2014 report. So the minister stands there and attempts to argue that this isn't a rush and it is an attempt to ram through the legislation. Once again, he's relying on his what seems to be one key line, which is Labor luminaries. And as I pointed out, I could continue to stand here and talk about Liberal luminaries till the cows come home, but it's not really a policy rationale for the approach to be taken. But more concerning about the policy rationale are several issues that I'll come to. I'll come to the issue. No, I'll leave that issue for now. I'll stay on the issue of the consideration of the JSCM committee's recommendations. Now, Senator Cormann came into this place at 10:08 on the morning that the JSCM report was tabled in the House. So I think it was tabled at about 9:05 by the chair in the House. And by 10:08, Senator Cormann is telling us the government has considered the issues raised and the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee to introduce a form of optional preferential voting below the line. And whilst I can accept that the minister was watching the hearings, still hiding behind a department that he wasn't prepared to allow to front the committee, just remember that bit. So he's studiously sitting in his office, following the hearings, following the issues, talking to a few people about their views on these issues. But when I ask a really basic question, which is when did government consider, he then says, after the report, and I had a chat with a few fellows. Seriously. Is that the way this government functions? Did the amendments before the Senate now go before Cabinet?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The amendments before the Senate went through all of the proper processes. I'm happy to confirm that, and I'm also happy to refer Senator Collins to the revised explanatory memorandum for the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016, which again confirms, and I'm quoting, that the bill, which is the bill before the Senate, responds to key elements of the first interim report and the final report of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters inquiry into the 2013 federal election, which were tabled on 9 May 2014 and 15 April 2015, respectively. Now, in relation to the matter of principle about whether or not the government would consider taking on board the suggestion that had been made by a range of stakeholders to also make some improvements to the voting arrangements for voting below the line, as I've indicated. We started some consideration within government in relation to these matters as a result of the evidence that was provided at the hearing. And subsequently, and after the report was tabled, the government made a formal decision, and that decision has since been reflected in amendments which I believe were circulated in the Senate on the Thursday. So I believe that the report by the 2016 report by JSCM was tabled about just after 9 on the Wednesday, and by Thursday afternoon, indeed, the government had circulated some amendments, having taken the in principle decision that we would adopt the view of many and the recommendation that was reflected in the JSCM committee report that there should be relevant improvements to below-the-line voting arrangements, which we've adopted.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I'm still asking, when was even that in-principle decision taken? You say that these decisions were taken in an appropriate way. You have refused to answer my question about whether the changes that these most recent amendments represent went through Cabinet. And I press that question.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Senator Collins has been here long enough, and she has been a cabinet minister herself. I don't talk about what goes and what doesn't go before cabinet, but let me just again very firmly put on the record that the amendments that the government will be moving during this committee stage of the debate in relation to below-the-line voting arrangements in the Senate have gone through all of the appropriate processes of the coalition, and of course they directly respond to the relevant recommendations made by the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters in its report released a few weeks ago. I'm not quite sure what point Senator Collins is trying to prove. I'm not quite sure what conspiracy theory she's trying to pursue. I would have thought that the government acted in very good faith. We put our bill out for consideration. It was scrutinised by people across Australia who made submissions to the inquiry. The submissions were obviously there for all to see. I had a number of conversations. With some people who made submissions to try and understand some of their points a bit better. And of course, in the end, the government made a decision to initiate a further amendment, and that is something that I did indeed announce on Wednesday morning. I believe when I was finally allowed the opportunity to speak in what had by then been a 6-hour debate on whether or not the Senate should accept the message, a 6-hour debate on whether the Senate should accept the message from the House of Representatives in relation to this bill and whether we should allow this bill to be read a first time. From memory, it was around about 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning that I rose to speak, and by then clearly I had all my ducks in a row, and I was able to make relevant announcements in this chamber.
Senator Collins.
Yes, Chair, I suppose we need to still have some humour in this, although it's not very funny, some of the poor processes that the Greens have allowed to occur. But the minister stands here and wanders between the appropriate processes of the coalition, the appropriate processes of government, and he refuses to cover a very important issue, which is a joint parliamentary committee makes its recommendations at roughly 9:05, and by 10:08, through means that the minister can't describe other than that he chatted with a few colleagues, we have the minister announcing that the government has considered the issues raised and the recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee to introduce a form of operational preferential voting below the line. Now, as the minister says, I have been a member of the Cabinet and I have been around this place a long time. Unlike some, Minister, I don't accept that you're Superman. I'm more likely to accept the musings that were on Anthony Green's blog, which was the government had a predetermined position on this, that the bill as it was introduced into the House, was actually their ambit position, and that they were thinking that they'd back down to the crossbenchers and respond on below-the-line issues at a later point. Now, being able to perform the somersaults that Senator Cormann was able to do between 9:05 and 10:08 on the day that he announced the government's position, the same morning that the JSCOM report occurred, combined with the points that I made earlier even about some of the recommendations, such as the government and the Green committee members seem to have picked up policy rationales by osmosis, because they don't exist anywhere else, it really does make you think this whole process stinks. But since the minister, and I should highlight this point, is not prepared to advise the committee when he sought advice from his department, when he had discussions with any particular people, whether this issue had been addressed by Cabinet, and he retreats back to coalition processes. I'm really not sure why, because he doesn't seem to have any respect for Labor Party processes. He wants to stand here and talk about Labor luminaries rather than a unified position of the current Labor caucus. So, on that respect, Minister, you're just going to have to deal with that fact. The Labor caucus is united, we have a clear position, and I am here to execute that position. I'm not a backroom boy, I'm not Senator Conroy or I'm not Senator Dastiari, but they're the facts of life. And if we have to, by virtue of this deal you have with the Greens, conduct what should be proper parliamentary consideration through a committee-stage debate, well, possibly my colleagues would even suggest that I'm probably in a good position to do that. But it's a very concerning world that this is where we are. And perhaps now I'll use the other example of this point. And the other example is the second reading amendment that was voted down by the Australian Greens that Senator Moore used. Because there's a principle at play here, a principle that's far more important than this particular piece of legislation that the Greens have wishingly colluded with the government to trample. And that principle is public interest immunity. Now, the Senate has upheld on countless occasions in relation to public interest immunity, and I see Senator Ludlam raising and paying attention on this point because I know it's been a very important issue to him as well. But he may not understand that when he voted down Senator Moore's second reading amendment, exactly what was occurring there. Because what was occurring there was, in response to my return to order, Senator Cormann had retreated to the commercial interests of the Commonwealth. I'm talking about the commercial interest aspect at the moment, but if you'd like to make that contribution, you're welcome to. I'm not suggesting that's not part of it, but the issue of principle that the Greens have colluded with, quite astoundingly, is that they have allowed you to continue to hide behind the commercial interests of the Commonwealth to important questions about the considerations of this bill. And all that Senator Moore was seeking was that you be required to outline what harm was being claimed. That's all. What harm? What was the particular harm that would occur to the public interest by you responding to that return to order? It's a pretty routine matter. Many times in this place over the years I've been here, ministers have sought to hide behind commercial interests. Now, Senator Ludlam might be able to give me of an example, but I can't think of one at hand, where the Senate, in response to that, has been to require that the minister at least indicate the harm that they're proposing might occur. But on this occasion, the first that I can think of, the Greens have colluded with the government and ensured that they don't even need to put before the Senate what the harm is that they're proposing might come forward. Now, again, I can only hypothesise here, and I know even some in the media have also, but the types of harm are issues related to transparency. Because, for example, in West Australia on the 7th of March, after some people had had an opportunity to look at the limited information that the minister provided in highly redacted form, there was a story there from Paul Osborne talking about his concerns about AEC funding. Now, I know Senator Rhiannon had an interest in a few matters, but none of those concerns seem to have been resolved, so I'll be interested to see if she eventually attempts to press you on any of these matters. But, Minister, in your first— yes, it was in the first reading contribution, you said the JSCM recommended— that must have been the 2014 recommendation because I don't recall it from the 2016 one— that additional resources be provided to the AEC to educate voters on changes, and you said we are allocating additional resources to the AEC. Now, it seems, at least to date, the Greens are satisfied with that assurance, but nobody else is. They've not been required to indicate the nature of the additional resources, where those funds are going to come from, when, how will the various appropriation debates we're having actually impact on whether those funds will arrive in time or not, the timing issues associated with that, or indeed the longer historical issues that Paul Osborne highlights about the funding and about what this return to order actually showed. So let me go for a moment to the return to order because, again, perhaps in a more casual way, it certainly is sniffy enough to suggest we need to keep looking. So, for instance, and I apologise in advance, Chair, if you will think of this as a prop, but I need senators to understand the highly redacted form in which this documentation was provided. So perhaps we both need to take advice from the clerks as to whether it's appropriate that I demonstrate for senators the redactions that the minister made. So the first of those documents is an agenda. Item 3 is matters to discuss. Fully redacted. Seriously? The next page. I reckon that would come close to about 80% redacted. But even what's been provided is interesting in part. For instance, the bottom dot point on page 1 of 2 of the next document is that the AEC felt that the Parliament expects major changes to both operation and legislation, noting that legislative change will be a challenge. Now, this is from the Executive Strategy meeting of the AEC and the Department of Finance, and this is dated the 29th of April 2015. I think the same date Paul Osborne was referring to some of the critical financing and resourcing issues. But in terms of us being able to understand in any way what the nature of those challenges might be, redaction, 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 and more redaction. But the intriguing part to these documents when I looked at them was a difference reference here. And this was on an executive strategy meeting on the 9th of June 2015. And you go to page 2 and the action items. Now, I'll be interested, Minister, if you're able to explain to us these action items, because it really is quite intriguing. Action item 1 is that the AEC will identify areas of JSCM response that they should not be consulted on. Why on earth would the AEC be identifying areas that they should not be consulted on? I could understand why they'd identify areas that they should be consulted on, but what was the minister trying to hide here? Why on earth do we have a government agency whose independence is as important as that of the AEC in executive minutes suggesting that the AEC will, as their action item, the AEC will identify areas of JSCM response that they should not be consulted on? In other words, don't ask us about this. And to finish the dot point, with also any advice on preferred method of engagement in advance of the meeting on the 24th of June. Preferred method of engagement? What are we engaged in here? This is a public agency. Preferred method of engagement? From the AEC? What is going on in these executive strategy meetings? What is really occurring here? Now, does that explain why so much of this needs to be redacted? Or perhaps the minister can inform the committee now the response to the question that should have been supported by the Greens in relation to the return to order, which is what harm to the Commonwealth's commercial interests are you suggesting requires this information not to be made available?
Minister. Thank you very much, Chair. Let me firstly, in a bipartisan spirit, agree with Senator Collins' assertion that I'm indeed not Superman. I've never claimed to be Superman, and clearly I'm somebody who's trying to do the best he can to get these reforms through the Senate, but definitely not that. Now, as much as Senator Collins is desperate to find a conspiracy theory here, there is actually no conspiracy theory. Obviously, the government was not only aware of what was taking place at the hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters on the 29th of February 2016. We were also aware of the submissions that were made to that inquiry. We were self-evidently considering the issues after the public response to the reform proposal that we had put forward. And yes, we did have further conversations, among other things, with the Australian Greens and others, and including the Labor Party. I had further conversations with the Labor Party because at that point in time, on the 29th of February, Mr Gray was still the shadow minister for electoral matters. Mr Gray was still the spokesperson for the Labor Party on matters related to Senate electoral reform. Now, Senator Collins chose to very selectively read and quote from my response to the order for production of documents. I pride myself in this chamber to always respond in a very timely fashion and to the fullest extent possible to the requests for documents. Now, Senator Collins selectively quoted from my letter by referring to a claim in part in relation to the commercial interests of the Commonwealth, but let me read the full claim. I claim public interest immunity for these exclusions on the grounds that some relate to cabinet deliberations, and that is a long-standing position which was adopted, among others, by the government that she was a part of. And the same to the commercial interests of the Commonwealth, which would be harmed in the event of disclosure, and to the private information of Commonwealth officers, including junior officer information. Now, there was a subsequent order passed, and I had written to the President of the Senate in order to respond to that subsequent order. But because of the way the proceedings developed today, we didn't get to that point in the proceedings where this was to be tabled. So I table this now, but I'm happy to confirm for the Senate that in that letter I reaffirm my previous claim of public interest immunity for certain documents recording communications between the ASC and ministers or officials. I reaffirm that my claim of public interest immunity for certain documents was consistent with the established precedents of the Senate around protecting the deliberations of Cabinet, protecting commercial interests of the Commonwealth, and respecting certain personal information of Commonwealth officers, including private contact details and junior officer identities. So I table that now. Can you just sit back and let me deal with the questions that you've asked? I mean, again, I listened to you courteously and in silence. And I know that courtesy is not something that you sort of spontaneously embrace, but perhaps let me just answer your question. Now, the ASC in its evidence, at the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, and you say it was so short, it shouldn't have taken you that long to read through the Hansard of that evidence, the ASC actually addressed this precise point. Not only did the ASC advise the committee that they would be sufficiently funded to implement these reforms and to comprehensively educate the public about the changes and to run the next election. The Electoral Commissioner also indicated at the public Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters hearing into this bill that because the Electoral Commission uses external providers, that there is a commercial in confidence element to this funding, and that it would not be appropriate to go into specific funding amounts at this time, well, that is exactly the point. You asked me what commercial interests are relevant to the information that's been redacted. Well, I've just given you a very.
Senator Collins.
You asked a question and I'm answering it. That is the way this process is meant to work. Now, I mean, just because you don't like the answer, don't abuse me trying to actually, in good faith, answer your questions. Now, in relation to the second reading amendment that was moved by Senator Moore, clearly that amendment was simply the latest in a long line of Labor tactics and Labor attempts to delay proper debate on this important bill. I mean, there was a part in that second reading amendment which, and I'm sure that Senator Collins knows this, but she didn't quote it when she was having a crack at Senator Ludlam. She left that bit out, that bit which said that the effect of the second reading amendment was to defer consideration of this bill to another day. I mean, yeah, sure. Now, so here is Senator Collins having a crack at Senator Ludlam, allegedly for going against their long-established position in favour of transparency. Let me say to you, in this Senate, when I was in opposition, I championed the disclosure of information and forcing the government of the day at the time to properly claim a public interest immunity. I take a very strong interest in these matters, as I know does Senator Ludlam, and we had a number of conversations about that when I was in opposition. And let me tell you that, and I'm very sad if you haven't noticed this, but I mean, in government I have prided myself to genuinely and in good faith and in due deference and respect to the important role of the Senate to scrutinise the activities of government. I pride myself in responding in a timely fashion to the orders of the production of documents, and in as comprehensive fashion as is appropriate, given the limitations of established public interest immunity claims that are able to be made. But at least, compare this to the previous Labor government. I mean, I was trying to get information out of the previous Labor government in relation to their disastrous mining tax deal, negotiated in secret and behind closed doors with the chief executives of 3 big mining companies. I got nothing. In fact, for weeks and weeks, it was completely ignored. Now, Senator Collins has started to put in orders for the production of documents late one afternoon, expecting a lot of information to be tabled the next morning. So I'm sorry if some of the officers weren't able to get all of the information together and have it properly scrutinised and put into the right format in time for 9:30 the next morning, but as quickly as we possibly could. And indeed, I sought leave before question time from memory on the Thursday of the last sitting week. From memory, that would have been the 2nd of March. I sought leave, and I was granted leave to table the response and the various documents, and we provided as much information as we possibly could. But there are some bits of the documents that were asked for that relate to cabinet deliberations. There are some bits that relate to the commercial interests of the Commonwealth. There are some bits that relate to private information of junior Commonwealth officers or the private contact details of Commonwealth officers, and consistent with long-established precedent and long-established practice, we have indeed redacted these bits. But this is the Labor Party clearly has got nothing to say against the substance of the reform that we're putting forward. They clearly have got no criticism of what we're actually doing to empower voters to direct not only their primary vote but their preferences the way they wish, instead of having those preferences traded and directed by backroom operators. That is why they're going down all these little rabbit holes, chasing one conspiracy theory after the other, because when it comes to the substance of the debate, you haven't asked a single question yet that in any way challenges the proposition that we're putting forward, and that is that this bill will actually ensure that results at future Senate elections will truly reflect the will of the Australian people, because these reforms will empower voters across Australia to direct their preferences the way they want to, and not the way political parties want to. And that is what we're trying to do. We understand why you're going to do everything you can between now and maybe over the next 3 or 4 or 5 days. We're ready for it. And that is why you're now just going down every little conspiracy theory rabbit hole, because you haven't got anything to say on the substance of the legislation.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair.